Title: Toxic Echoes. It was a moonless night when I ventured into the heart of the abandoned factory, lured by the haunting whispers of an environmental horror that had long been forgotten. The air was thick with an acrid scent, a pungent cocktail of decay and industrial waste that clawed at my throat. The crumbling walls of the factory bore the scars of a bygone era, rusted metal and shattered windows providing a skeletal backdrop to the malevolent secrets hidden within. As I stepped cautiously through the broken doorway, the silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant hum of an unseen generator. My flashlight struggled to penetrate the darkness, casting long, distorted shadows that danced on the decayed remnants of forgotten machinery. The air was unnaturally still, and the echoes of my own footsteps seemed to linger like a whispering specter. I had heard rumors of this place, tales of a once thriving factory that had succumbed to environmental negligence, poisoning the land and air with toxic substances. It was said that the factory had been abruptly abandoned, leaving behind a sinister legacy that clung to the decaying structures. Intrigued by the chilling tales, I, a freelance investigative journalist seeking a story that would send shivers down spines, couldn't resist the temptation to explore the heart of this environmental nightmare. As I delved deeper into the bowels of the factory, the air grew thicker, and my skin prickled with an unseen force. The floor beneath my boots felt spongy, each step accompanied by a sickening squelch. It was as if the very ground was alive, pulsating with a malevolent energy that seeped into my bones. My flashlight flickered, casting erratic beams that revealed glimpses of grotesque shapes lurking in the shadows. Unearthly whispers echoed through the vast, desolate chambers, a symphony of eerie murmurs that spoke of the factory's tortured past. My heart raced, and a cold sweat broke out on my brow as the oppressive atmosphere closed in around me. The factory's once mighty machines now lay dormant, coated in a sickly film of toxic residue. Pipes snaked along the walls like bloated serpents, oozing a viscous substance that seemed to pulse with a malignant life of its own. I couldn't shake the feeling that the very air I breathed was tainted, carrying with it the sins of environmental neglect. A distant, ghostly moan echoed through the factory, sending shivers down my spine. I quickened my pace, my footsteps echoing through the cavernous space like a desperate heartbeat. The environmental horror that clung to this forsaken place seemed to manifest in the twisted metal and rotting structures that surrounded me, each decaying piece a testament to the price paid for unchecked industrial greed. As I reached the heart of the factory, I stumbled upon a room that seemed frozen in time. Barrels labeled with ominous warnings stood like silent sentinels, their contents long since spilled and absorbed into the very foundation of the building. The air in this room was thicker than ever, a toxic fog that seemed to distort reality itself. In the feeble glow of my flickering flashlight, I saw shadows moving, contorting into grotesque shapes that defied the laws of nature. The environmental horror had taken on a physical form, a manifestation of the factory's tortured soul. I felt the weight of the unseen eyes upon me, scrutinizing my intrusion into the realm of forgotten nightmares. A sudden gust of wind howled through the broken windows, extinguishing my flashlight. I stood in absolute darkness, surrounded by the suffocating embrace of the factory's secrets. Panic seized me, and I fumbled for my phone, praying its feeble light would pierce the shadows. As the screen flickered to life, the room was revealed in all its grotesque glory. The barrels in the room seemed to pulse with a sickly glow, casting eerie shadows that danced on the walls. The air itself seemed to writhe, as if the factory's toxic legacy had taken on a life of its own. I gasped as I caught sight of my reflection in a shattered piece of glass. My eyes were wide with terror, and my face was pallid with the realization that I was not alone. The environmental horror had awakened, and the factory's poisoned past sought retribution. A guttural groan echoed through the room, a sound that seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves. I stumbled backward, my breath catching in my throat. The shadows coalesced into nightmarish forms, contorted figures that bore the grotesque scars of environmental decay. In the unearthly glow, I saw faces twisted in agony, their mouths open in silent screams. The factory's spectral inhabitants, victims of a past that refused to be forgotten, reached out to me with skeletal hands. The toxic residue clung to their ethereal forms, a gruesome reminder of the environmental sins that had sealed their fates. I turned to flee, but the very air seemed to constrict around me, a suffocating force that held me captive in the heart of the factory's horrors. The walls pulsed with a sickly light, and the moans of the tormented echoed in my ears. I was entangled in the web of an environmental nightmare, a witness to the vengeful spirits that rose from the poisoned soil. The factory itself seemed to come alive, the decaying machinery groaning and creaking as if animated by a malevolent force. The toxic residue dripped from the walls, forming puddles that seemed to bubble with a sinister intent. I waded through the sickly substance, each step heavier than the last, as if the very air had turned to a viscous sludge. I felt a cold hand on my shoulder, and I recoiled in horror. The specters of the factory's past surrounded me, their anguished faces inches from mine. The environmental horror had taken a corporeal form, and I was ensnared in its toxic embrace. The factory's victims whispered in a chorus of despair, their voices a cacophony of haunting lamentations. I could feel the weight of their pain, the burden of an environmental tragedy that had transcended the boundaries of life and death. The factory had become a purgatory for the forsaken, a realm where the sins of the past clung to the very fabric of reality. Desperation fueled my movements as I stumbled through the spectral throng. The air itself seemed to burn with a noxious energy, searing my lungs with each breath. I could taste the bitterness of the factory's poisoned legacy, a taste that lingered on my tongue like a curse. In the distance, a flickering light drew my attention. I staggered toward it, the shadows parting before me like a curtain. The source of the light was a doorway leading to a corridor that seemed to stretch into infinity. With each step, the moans of the tormented grew fainter, replaced by an ominous hum that resonated through the very foundations of the factory. The corridor seemed to warp and twist, a surreal passage through a nightmare realm. The walls pulsed with an otherworldly energy, and the air shimmered with an ethereal glow. I felt as if I were moving through the bowels of a living organism, a sentient being that bore the scars of environmental atrocities. As I reached the end of the corridor, the oppressive atmosphere lifted, and I emerged into a vast chamber bathed in an unnatural light. The walls of this chamber were lined with towering vats, each filled with a luminous substance that seemed to defy the laws of physics. The air was charged with a palpable energy, and I could feel the very essence of the factory's horrors converging in this surreal space. In the center of the chamber stood a colossal structure, a pulsating mass of tendrils and sinew that reached toward the heavens. The environmental horror had taken on a grotesque form, a manifestation of the factory's poisoned soul. I watched in awe and terror as the pulsating mass undulated, its movements synchronized with the tortured whispers that echoed through the chamber. I realized that I stood in the heart of the factory's malevolence, a witness to the environmental horror that had festered in the shadows for far too long. The pulsating mass seemed to beckon me, its tendrils extending like skeletal fingers. I felt a compulsion, an irresistible urge to approach and confront the very source of the factory's sins. As I stepped closer, the luminous substance in the vats seemed to surge and flow toward the colossal structure. The air crackled with an otherworldly energy, and the whispers of the tormented reached a crescendo. I could feel the very fabric of reality unraveling, as if the environmental horror sought to consume me and assimilate me into its twisted existence. A blinding light enveloped me, and I was plunged into a surreal dreamscape. I stood on the precipice of a churning abyss, the boundaries between the physical and metaphysical realms blurred. The factory's victims surrounded me, their spectral forms merging with the pulsating mass that loomed overhead. The environmental horror spoke to me in the language of the forsaken, a symphony of wails and lamentations that echoed through the depths of my soul. I understood the factory's pain, the price paid for humanity's disregard for the delicate balance of the natural world. The factory had become a vessel for the sins of environmental negligence, a grotesque monument to the consequences of unchecked industrial greed. I felt the weight of responsibility, a burden to bear witness to the factory's tortured past and expose the environmental horror that had festered in the shadows. As the surreal dreamscape dissolved around me, I found myself back in the heart of the factory, the colossal structure pulsating with an otherworldly energy. With newfound determination, I staggered toward the exit, the shadows of the factory's victims parting before me. The air was still thick with toxicity, but the oppressive atmosphere seemed to lift as I emerged into the moonlit night. I stumbled out of the decaying factory, the haunted whispers fading into the distance. As I gazed back at the forsaken structure, I knew that the environmental horror had not been vanquished but exposed. The factory's poisoned legacy lingered, a cautionary tale etched into the very fabric of the abandoned walls. I carried with me the harrowing memories of the spectral voices and the luminous chamber, a witness to the environmental nightmare that had festered in the heart of the factory. The moon cast an eerie glow on the dilapidated facade, and I made my way through the desolate landscape, haunted by the environmental horror that lingered in the recesses of my mind. The factory stood as a silent sentinel, a testament to the consequences of humanity's disregard for the delicate balance of the natural world. As I walked away, the whispers of the tormented echoed in the night, a chilling reminder that the environmental horror could not be silenced. The abandoned factory had become a monument to the sins of the past, a spectral battleground where the ghosts of negligence and greed fought for recognition in the shadows. I knew that my journey into the heart of the factory had not only exposed the environmental horror that lurked within, but had also bound my fate to the tortured spirits that dwelled there. The echoes of the factory's toxic legacy would forever resonate in the recesses of my mind, a haunting reminder that some nightmares are not easily forgotten.